So let's picture this. Deep in the Canadian Rockies, right? Kananaskis.
Yeah, stunning place.
Usually.
But it's not exactly a quiet retreat right now. World leaders are gathering there.
For the 2025 G7 Leaders Summit. And yeah, it's pretty much on lockdown. Beautiful, but isolated.
And that isolation, that's key, isn't it? It brings its own set of, well, complexities.
Definitely.
We're diving deep into this summit today, based on a whole stack of articles, reports you've gathered, different takes on what's really happening.
That's right. We're looking at the challenges, the huge security operation, the big issues driving those closed-door talks.
And our mission here is really to unpack all that, cut through the noise, you know.
Exactly. Look at the G7's purpose today, the divisions, the high stakes everyone's talking about in these reports, and what it means to host it in Kananaskis.
We're sticking strictly to what's in these sources, trying to give you the clearest possible picture of this, well, this crucial meeting.
Okay, so where do we start? The G7 itself. Yeah, let's do that. The sources remind us this group goes back 50 years. Started as the G6.
Right, during some big economic shocks back then. It was about shared beliefs, democracy, liberty, cooperation.
Trying to boost trade, stabilize finance. Canada joined a bit later, made it the G7.
That's the origin story. But the world's changed. A lot. The sources really hammer this home.
How so?
Well, look at the economics. The G7's share of global GDP, it's fallen significantly. From like 63% back in the early 90s down to around 44% today.
That's a big drop.
It is. And maybe the even bigger challenge, something the sources keep circling back to, is when the instability isn't just out there, but seems to coming from inside the group.
Ah, the internal friction.
Exactly. These ongoing trade disputes between G7 members. That's a prime example highlighted in the reports. It really strains that original purpose of coordination.
We saw that play out pretty dramatically back in 2018, didn't we? As Charlevoix.
Oh, yeah. The sources definitely point to Charlevoix. Those negotiations over the final statement, the communique, apparently they were really fractious.
Arguing over wording, right? Like a rules-based order versus the rules-based order. Paris Accord mentions Iran.
All that stuff. And then the memorable part, after they finally hashed something out, one leader just renounced it on Twitter after leaving.
Yeah, that kind of symbolized the whole thing.
And several reports suggest that whole experience probably looms large over Kananaskis. There's this sense that getting any consensus now might mean
watering things down. A race to the bottom, as one source put it.
Pretty much just finding the lowest common denominator everyone can vaguely agree on, because papering over the cracks is getting harder.
Okay, so against that backdrop, what are the big global issues on the table? According to the sources, Ukraine is obviously huge.
Absolutely central, but also really divisive within the group. That's a key theme in the reporting.
President Zelensky's attending, seeking support, more sanctions.
Right. And trying to maybe mend fences or rekindle ties with President Trump, whose stance has been, let's say, less predictable.
And you really see the split approaches there in the reports. The EU is pushing ahead with more sanctions on Russia. Their 18th package, apparently.
Yeah, signaling they want to keep the pressure on. But then you contrast that with the analysis of President Trump's actions.
The reports say he's threatened sanctions but hasn't really followed through.
That's the picture painted. The rationale mentioned is concern about hindering future business with Moscow, which, as the sources note, is pretty different from the European view.
Their view being that strength is the only language Russia understands.
That seems to be the perspective reported from European allies, yes. And this split shows up in the oil price cap debate, too.
Right. The EU wants to lower it, Zelenskyy wants it even lower, but the U.S. was hesitant before.
Exactly. EU pushing for $45 a barrel, Zelenskyy for $30, while the U.S. previously opposed dropping it from $60. It raises questions about their collective punch, you know?
If they're not unified.
It potentially undermines the whole effort. Signs of disunity, like the U.S. reportedly balking at language like further support for Ukraine, or refusing to call the invasion illegal in past talks.
The report suggests that emboldens Moscow and hurts Ukraine's ability to fight.
That's the concern highlighted, yes. Along with broader worries noted about the Trump administration's, quote, lukewarm commitment to military aid and questioning NATO.
Ukrainian lawmakers warning about dire consequences if U.S. aid drops off.
It's definitely causing strategic recalculations among allies, based on the sources.
Okay, so beyond Ukraine, what else is dominating? The Israel-Iran crisis seems to be casting a long shadow.
Huge shadow. Tensions are incredibly high after recent strikes, and there's this one striking detail in a source.
What's that?
The report that President Trump apparently vetoed an Israeli plan targeting Iran's supreme leader.
Wow. Okay, that indicates some serious direct involvement at the highest levels.
It certainly suggests that, and the UK's Prime Minister Starmer has reportedly talked about de-escalation efforts, expecting intense discussions on this.
And this is likely to fuel protests near the summit too, you'd imagine.
Almost certainly. And linking back to the internal stuff, those trade disputes are still there, casting a pall, as the sources say.
Avoiding new tariffs is top of mind for everyone, including the invited guests.
Yeah, and President Trump's reported suggestion of making deals by letter, plus his past use of bilateral meetings to apply pressure. That's part of the dynamic leaders are bracing for.
Navigating that must be tricky.
That's putting it mildly, I think.
So let's shift to Canada, the host.
Mm-hmm.
What are their stated priorities, according to the material?
Prime Minister Carney's team outlined 3 main buckets. First, protecting our communities in the world. So security, foreign interference, wildfires, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Second, building energy security and accelerating the digital transition, focusing on critical minerals, AI, quantum tech.
Right.
And third, securing the partnerships of the future. That's about investment, jobs, open markets. Trying to frame things within the G7's broader scope, but with Canadian interests too.
And the big one, especially with Trump there, NATO spending. Carney says Canada will hit the 2% target.
But seemed hesitant about Trump's proposed 5% target. The report suggests he framed it as prioritizing protecting Canadians directly.
Interesting nuance.
Yeah.
Canada's also joining a European rearmament deal.
That's reported too, yeah. Signaling commitment, maybe just not entirely in the way the U.S. president wants.
Which brings us to this Golden Dome missile defense idea. That sounds significant.
It is. President Trump proposing this joint U.S.-Canada system, asking Canada to chip in, $61 billion?
$61 billion.
It's a huge ask, and it taps into this strategic debate. Canada apparently feels it has some leverage because missiles heading for the U.S. would likely fly over the Canadian Arctic.
So the U.S. needs Canadian territory for it to work best.
Experts cited in the sources say the U.S. could do it alone, but not as well. So Canada investing in radar systems could be a diplomatic chip, maybe gain concessions elsewhere.
But the Canadian public isn't sold.
Polling mentioned in the report suggests not. Most Canadians apparently prefer that money goes to conventional forces, subs, jets, frigates, soldiers.
It's a tough calculation, though. Missile tech is advancing.
Exactly. Hypersonics, things like that. Sources highlight this might force Canada to think seriously about kinetic defense actually shooting missiles down, not just detection, regardless of the cost or current opinion.
That adds urgency. Okay, who else is there besides the G7 members? Canada invited quite a few guests.
Yeah, leaders from India, Ukraine, Brazil, South Africa, South Korea, Australia, Mexico, the UAE.
It seems like an effort to broaden the conversation, engage with other key players.
That's how it's being interpreted in the sources, yeah. Expanding partnerships, especially with countries generally aligned with G7 interests. Notably, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was reportedly invited but isn't attending.
Okay, let's talk Kananaskis itself. The location. Why pick somewhere so remote?
Security, security, security. That's the overwhelming message in the reports. Beautiful, yes, but primarily chosen because it can be locked down tight.
And the lockdown is serious. Access restricted from Juneteenth to 18th.
Very serious. Described as a massive operation. Thousands of personnel, RCMP, military, others, fencing, cameras, a tight perimeter.
What's the local impact bit? Like peak season, right?
Yeah, it's hitting local businesses and residents hard. Sources mention some people are, quote, ticked off about the closures. Trails, golf courses, campgrounds, businesses, all shut down in the core area.
Tough, even if it's temporary.
Definitely an inconvenience, though some visitors apparently got in just before the lockdown. But the sources really get into the unique security challenges of this mountain environment.
You mentioned multi-domain disruption. What does that mean here?
It means threats can come from different angles and interact. Like environmental risks, it's wildfire season, Kananaskis is high risk, fires nearby could mess with air surveillance or evacuation routes.
And flooding. June's wet, right? Remember 2013?
Exactly. Flooding could cut off ground access, which leads to another challenge, access itself.
Only one main road in, Highway 40.
Pretty much makes it predictable. Easier to control, maybe, but also potentially easier to surveil or even target choke points. And the terrain,
Mountains, forests.
hard to watch everything.
Very hard. Good for concealment. Hostile actors could potentially use backcountry trails days ahead. Elevation changes mess with sensors and aerial views, too.
And protests are expected.
Yeah, potentially tense protests, sources say, fueled by Ukraine, Israel, Palestine. But the protest zones are miles away in Banff and Calgary.
With live feeds shown to leaders. Does that work?
Well, reports note concerns about the lack of direct interaction, and highway protests are a no-go. Security is bracing for confrontations but aiming for peaceful demonstrations in those designated spots.
What about cyber threats? Digital security?
Big concern. Increased cyber attacks expected. And this idea of cyberkinetic convergence, digital attacks triggering physical problems, plus worries about old digital credentials from past events being exploitable.
And the insider threat. People working there. Right. Highlighted as a real risk. Authorized staff could be anyone from officials to caterers with grievances or motives exploiting their access for sabotage or disruption.
That paints a complex security picture.
It really does. And just coordinating all the different agencies, federal, provincial, local, international, in that remote setting is another layer of difficulty mentioned in the reports.
Okay, shifting back to diplomacy briefly. Any key bilateral meetings highlighted?
President Trump's meetings with Prime Minister Carney and also with Mexican President Sheinbaum, that's reportedly their first face-to-face.
And some interesting signaling happening, too. Macron in Greenland.
Yeah, that stopover in Greenland territory Trump once talked about buying is seen as a pointed message. Macron saying Greenland is not to be sold, calling it a wake-up call for Europeans, definitely adds a bit of spice.
We're also seeing some new faces at the G7 table this year.
Right. Germany's Chancellor Merz, UK's Keir Starmer, Japan's Shigeru Ishiba, and South Korea's new President Lee Jae-myung.
Starmer met Carney beforehand. There was some commentary mentioned in the sources about Starmer's efforts to woo Trump.
Yeah, putting him in a slightly awkward spot with Canada, apparently. Some criticism reported that he didn't push back harder on Trump's past 51st state-type rhetoric about Canada.
Though Starmer did affirm Canada's independence.
He did. But it just shows the delicate dance everyone's doing, navigating relationships, especially with President Trump back in the mix.
So let's try and pull this all together. Based on everything in these reports, what's the main takeaway from this Kananaskis summit?
I think the clearest message is that this is a really complex, really high-stakes moment for the G7. Its core purpose, economic coordination among democracies, is being seriously tested.
Tested by the internal trade fights, the different views on huge conflicts like Ukraine and Israel, Iran.
Exactly. And all that is layered on top of these unique security and logistical challenges of meeting in such a remote, albeit secure, location.
So success really hinges on finding some unity, especially navigating the dynamic with President Trump.
That seems crucial, based on the sources. Can they bridge these gaps? Can they agree on meaningful action?
Which leads to the final thought, maybe. Give these deep, persistent divisions on really core issues, trade, climate, conflict response, and all these intense security challenges.
Does Kananaskis signal the G7 is changing into something else? Or is it maybe struggling to hold on to its original vision in a much more fractured, volatile world than 50 years ago?
What does this meeting, however, turns out, tell us about the future of cooperation among these major powers? It's definitely something to watch.